A woman who spent her entire life making sure her child was at peace, while she herself never lived a single full day just for her own happiness. In every life, there are things we miss, only to regret them when it is already too late. But there are also things that, even if lost once, still leave a door open if we are brave enough to turn back and face them. Today, we continue James's journey back home with another memory of a woman who once waited for him with her entire youth. Episode 4: The Woman from Years Ago. James wandered along the long road leading into the town. That road had changed a great deal. The dirt path was now smoothly paved. New rows of buildings lined both sides. LED signs flickered brightly. Cars passed by without pause. Everything seemed to have learned how to adapt to modern life, faster, brighter, louder. Yet beneath that new surface, James could still see faint traces of old memories. He slowed his steps. Long ago, this road was nothing more than a narrow dirt path, red dust clinging to his heels every afternoon after school. At that bend ahead, James once ran with his friends, chasing one another, laughing until they could barely breathe, scraping their knees and still refusing to go home. Some afternoons, he walked while kicking a small stone ahead of him, trying to stretch the walk home a little longer, because he knew that at the end of that road waited a strict father, and the punishments that followed whenever he skipped school or came home late. He still remembered clearly what it felt like to be chased by his father along this very road. The heavy footsteps behind him, the ragged breathing, the fear mixed with something hard to name, not exactly pain, but the feeling of never being good enough in the eyes of an adult. James stopped at an intersection. Back then, it was right here that he once turned and ran, hiding in the trees by the roadside, lying still until night fully fell before daring to return home. Now, that patch of forest had become a small parking lot. There was nowhere left to hide and no one left to chase him. Lost in his drifting thoughts, James did not notice when he had stepped into the town. The streets opened before him, familiar yet strange. In the distance, among shops and restaurants that seemed completely renewed, he slowed as he drew closer and suddenly recognized it, the old diner on the corner. Its facade had faded, the wooden sign was peeling, the hand-painted letters no longer sharp. After all the years and changes, the place had kept its old character as if time itself had simply forgotten it. James stood still in front of the old diner. A light wind blew, making the wooden sign creak softly, a sound so familiar it hurt to hear. He had heard it hundreds of times in his life, only back then he was young, and still believed that time would always be on his side. In those days, James often sat at the table near the window, not because the food there tasted better, but because from that seat he could see her step out from the kitchen. She was not the kind of woman who stunned people at first glance, but there was something about her that James could not look away from. Maybe the way she lowered her head to tie her apron, or the way she smiled softly when she caught his gaze, as if that smile was meant only for him. The smell of food filled the air, pans clinked against each other. Laughter and chatter rose from the diners, but to James, all of it faded into the background the moment she placed a plate on the table and gently asked,
"Have you been waiting long?"
James always shook his head, even on days when he had been sitting there since very early. Their love began that way, not loud, not burning, just repeated afternoons, familiar glances, small conversations, slowly stretching over time. They spoke of simple things: a tiring day at work, a difficult customer, a vague dream of somewhere far beyond this town. James once held her hand on late evenings, after the diner had closed, when the two of them sat out front, sharing the leftover food. Her hand was always warm, his rough-stained with grease and ambition. He once said to her,
"I will leave someday, not because I don't love you, but because I want to return with something more worthy."
She did not ask him to stay. She only nodded and smiled a smile James would understand much later, as the smile of someone who had loved more than she ever dared to say. She believed him, believed that with a little more time, another winter, a few more letters, James would come back. But time waits for no one. James left with promises that were never fully formed, letters written halfway and never sent. Moments when he meant to return, only to tell himself, just a little longer. Each time, the distance between him and that small town grew a little more long enough for love to turn into memory. And she stayed. She kept opening the diner every morning, kept looking out at the road every afternoon, even though she knew no one would sit at the table near the window anymore. Then, one day, she learned to stop looking, not because she had forgotten, but because a human heart cannot wait forever without breaking. James stood in front of the old diner, his heart tightening. He realized a truth far too late. Some people do not leave us. They are simply left behind for too long. The memory did not hurt him in a sharp way. It ached quietly, like an old scar, needing only the lightest touch to sting. James understood that their love had once been real, and because it was real, it never truly disappeared, even as life had turned in other directions. He turned away, carrying with him an entire youth he never fully lived. The door opened softly. The woman standing before James took a few seconds to recognize him. Her eyes lingered longer than necessary, as if searching for an old image within a face worn down by time. Then she softly spoke his name so quietly it seemed meant only for herself.
James.
A single call of his name, and it felt as if an entire lifetime trembled. They stood facing each other, neither stepping forward. Between them was a very thin space, yet James knew it held decades of distance, missed meetings, and countless afternoons when she had stood in front of the diner, looking down the road and wondering whether he would come back today. She invited him inside. The room was simple, tidy. Everything carried the shape of someone long used to living alone. A chair placed close to the window. An old teapot set exactly where it belonged, no more, no less. James sat down, his hands resting on his knees, trembling slightly. He did not dare look around for too long, afraid he might see the empty spaces that once should have been his. They spoke to each other in very ordinary words. They asked about health, about the years gone by, questions anyone could ask and anyone could answer. But beneath every sentence, James heard what was left unsaid. The years of waiting, the long nights, the moments of telling herself, maybe tomorrow. In the end, she was the one to break the silence. She told him her story slowly, without blame. When James left, she had believed. She believed for a long time so deeply that whenever her family spoke of marriage, she only smiled and said she was still young, that she still had time. She had turned down many proposals, not because the men were unkind, but because in her heart there was still room for someone who had not yet returned. But time asks no one for permission. Her parents grew old. They worried. They did not need a beautiful love story, they needed reassurance. They wanted to see their daughter with a stable home. They wanted a grandchild to hold, to believe that life continued, that they had fulfilled their duty as parents. She said there were evenings when she sat alone, staring at the empty chair before her, wanting to scream that she was still waiting. But then she saw the grey hair of her mother, the bent back of her father, and understood that not everyone is allowed to wait forever for something that may never happen. She had accepted it, not because she stopped loving, but because she was too tired to keep hoping. Her marriage was not a bad one. The man was good, kind enough, responsible enough, but between them was a quiet space no one ever named. She fulfilled her role as a wife, as a daughter. Yet there were mornings when she woke up feeling empty, as if a part of her life had been left behind at some forgotten turn in the road. James listened, his throat tightening. He could not find any words that would not arrive too late. No sentence was strong enough to make up for the years she had spent teaching herself how to let go. All he could do was sit there, listening to each story as if it were his own verdict, never spoken aloud, yet impossible to deny. She looked at him, her eyes free of blame.
I once thought, if you had come back, just a little earlier,
she said, then stopped. She did not finish the sentence, because they both knew that just a little had passed a very long time ago. They sat in silence for a long while. James sat across from her, but his mind was no longer only in the present. His life after leaving that town had not been as smooth as people might imagine. He had passed through many places, done all kinds of work, fallen more than a few times. There were periods when he felt he had reached the bottom, his money slowly running out, his faith in himself wearing thin with each passing year. There were times, in cramped rented rooms in the city, when James thought of her, clearly thought of returning, of taking her to live with him. No need for wealth, only two people leaning on each other to go on. That thought once came very real, very close. But the weight of life carried him away. Debts that needed paying, opportunities that flickered and disappeared. Days when James was so exhausted he could only fall onto the bed and drift into sleep, forgetting that somewhere there was still someone who had once waited for him with her entire youth. That forgetting did not come from betrayal, but from exhaustion. Then James met someone, a benefactor. That man saw something trustworthy in him, gave him a chance, helped him back onto his feet, guided him step by step as he rebuilt his career. When James finally began to find stability, the man offered his daughter's hand in marriage. James hesitated for a long time. He no longer loved the way a young man does, but he understood that there are seasons in life when people do not choose by emotion, but by their ability to keep going. In the end, James accepted not as a replacement, but as a way of yielding to fate. He lived fully within his role, fully within his responsibility. No comparisons, no unnecessary nostalgia. The woman from years ago did not become a shadow intruding on his marriage. She simply lay quietly in a very deep corner of his memory, a place James rarely touched, yet could never erase. And time continued to move on. James's life took another turn. The person beside him also departed, following the natural order of life, leaving James alone to cross into the other slope of his years. No noise, no tragedy, only a very quiet loneliness. Now, sitting before the woman from years ago, James suddenly realized They had both lived nearly an entire lifetime. No one was young enough to dream recklessly anymore. No one had anything left to prove. On their faces were the marks of hidden wrinkles, eyes long accustomed to loss. Both of them stood on the far side of life's slope, where people are no longer rushed and no longer as afraid as before. They spoke very little, simple, scattered conversations that never went too deep. But in the quiet spaces between their words, James felt one thing very clearly. Her presence no longer filled him with regret, but carried a strange sense of calm, like meeting again a familiar piece of an old life. No one mentioned tomorrow. No one asked how far they would walk together. Everything was kept in the present tense, close enough to ease the emptiness, far enough not to wound what had already passed. When James stood up to leave, she walked him to the door. They stood there, silent for a while longer. No hands held, no promises made. Only a slow look enough to understand that some bonds, no matter how far they wander, eventually find their way back, not to begin again, but to close gently and completely. James stepped onto the small road in front of her house. The town in the late afternoon was quiet. The sun sank lower, covering everything in a soft, gentle light. He did not turn back, yet in his heart he knew clearly that from this moment on, the memory no longer belonged only to the past. It was now quietly walking side by side with the present.